Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Shine Dome and to the Walter Burley Griffin Symposium, the Griffin's Canberra 100 Years. My name's Anne Watson and I'm a member of the Griffin Society Committee. Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce John McInerney. I'm sure he's well known to many of you here this afternoon, and those of you who were at Caroline Pidcock's talk last night will know that, you know, when you get Caroline, fortunately you often also get John, a bit like Walter and Marion, really. I like to think they're channeling both of them. And John is an architect and town planner with special interests in transport and heritage. He is a past national president of the Planning Institute of Australia, former manager of planning for the City of Sydney and the City of Melbourne, and was ACT Commissioner for Land and Planning from 1997 to 2004. He's been an admirer of the Griffins since he resided at Newman College as a student in the 1960s, and I like to think of John, you know, lying in his Griffin bed in his Griffin dormitory and absorbing that kind of spirit. Anyway, that admiration has been informed and expanded by his subsequent outstanding planning career. So we're very lucky to have John here to introduce the symposium. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to you all. I just had visions of myself lying in my Griffin bed, which, by the way, he designed very hard beds for us students in Newman College, and absorbing the spirit of Griffin. I think I probably was absorbing other spirits in those days of my misspent youth, but it certainly was a transforming experience to spend some time in Newman College itself, living there and partaking of his architecture as a student. But in particular, I guess it led to my appreciation over the years, and I subsequently became the city planner of, I was then called the city planner architect of the city of Heidelberg, and was able to, of course, understand his Eaglemont subdivisions, and then subsequently in other jobs I've been involved with Griffin. So, as it were, the spirit of Griffin really has permeated my whole life in an extraordinary way, and here I am today introducing today's events on behalf of the Walter Burley Griffin Society. I would like to, in fact, now more formally welcome you to what is our centrepiece event of this festival. Many of you do know that the Society emerged in 1988. It had to do with an attempt to convince the Historic Houses Trust to acquire the Duncan House in Castle Crag. That ultimately was not entirely successful, but it was successful to the extent that the Walter Burley Griffin Society formed in 1988 by a dedicated band of volunteer enthusiasts, many of whom are actually here today. Amazingly, there's still a dedicated band of volunteer enthusiasts, only older. The Society, meanwhile, over the last 30 years, and thanks to the efforts of those volunteers, has become really an internationally recognised body, not only for its scholarship with regard to the Walter Burley Griffin buildings, but the whole philosophy and impact that the Griffins had on Australia, and the linkages back into America will be illustrated today by Professor Crudy. I'd like to thank, I guess, all of those people, those volunteers, and those people who've worked tireless hours over the last 30 years for again bringing us together today, but also for the work they've done, often to the detriment of, I suppose, to the other things in their lives that may have been calling them at the time, and often financially to their detriment as well, but I think we all thank them greatly. Coming back to today, as I walked to the library this morning, and many of you were at the library exhibition, and feeling the chill of a Canberra winter, I recall that Walter had also arrived, in fact, on Sunday, 100 years ago on Sunday, literally to this same place and in the same weather, I presume. So I hope he had some warm jumpers which he'd brought with him from Chicago, particularly for this morning. But what he would have noticed as time's gone on today has been the beauty of a Canberra day as the morning mists clear, the clear skies and literally the quality of the landscape, I'm sure, would have impressed him greatly for the few days that he was here. Looking back at that time, I also realised or read that he had been previously in Sydney and had been very impressed with Sydney, to the extent that, as I read, he had won over the Lord Mayor when he said that Sydney was about 5 times more beautiful than he had ever dreamt. So Walter, as we all know, was at times a great salesman. Myself, as an ex-Deputy Lord Mayor of Sydney, I can assure you that winning over the Sydney Lord Mayor was probably not that hard, certainly compared to the difficulty of winning over the Canberra bureaucrats he had to deal with when he arrived here. But today we're having a symposium, which the dictionary defines as a convivial meeting, usually following a dinner, for drinking, conversation and intellectual discussion. I'm afraid the resources of the Society don't quite extend to funding the drinking as required in the true Greek symposium, but we're providing tea and coffee at 2 o'clock this afternoon, and you will be then required to enter into appropriate deep conversation and intellectual discussions. To guarantee the highest level of intellectual scholarship today, we had not 1, not 2, but 3 professors to stimulate our neurons. As you have heard, unfortunately, we have lost one of our professors. Not entirely lost, as he's in hospital waiting an operation, and we wish him well over the coming weeks. And we have, of course, our 2 remaining professors to ensure that his paper will be duly presented later on. And Anne Watson will further talk of each of their backgrounds as we move to the latter part of this talk. But in mentioning that difficulty of winning over Canberra's bureaucrats, let me put a plug in for more recent work done by the bureaucrats of today. One of my roles some years back was on the advisory panel which oversaw the preparation of the Griffin legacy document or report, which was in fact a strategic vision for the 21st century for Canberra. And let me quote from the introduction, which I think sums up in many ways the hopes of that particular Griffin legacy. Yet Canberra still has not realised its full potential. The landscapes and monuments are not matched by a cosmopolitan lifestyle expected of such an important national and international centre. Parts of the city give a glimpse of the grand civic design envisaged by Walter Burley Griffin, but other areas are an anticlimax. Traffic dominates the central streets. Outdated office precincts are lost in a sea of car parks and are deserted after office hours. The city in many areas is cut off from the lake by a ring of freeways. It is 9 years since that legacy report was tabled, and much good planning and implementation has been done. Particularly, I noticed the City to the Lake project and the light rail proposal, which is now in fact part of the current government's program. But the dominance of the motor car is still apparent, and the cosmopolitan lifestyle, except for some very small locations, is still missing in action. I'm sure this centenary year celebrations, though, will go a long way to creating that cosmopolitan lifestyle, and I believe that that lifestyle was in fact in the mind of the Griffins when they first conceived of Canberra. There's one other matter that I'd briefly like to mention, and that is earlier this year, Caroline Pidcock, our speaker of last night, and I had the great good fortune of spending a day at Frank Lloyd Wright's building Falling Water in Pennsylvania. And those of you who have been there will understand how impressed we were, and I thought it was probably one of the finest buildings I've been in, and I've been in many buildings in the world. Caroline and I both appreciated an extraordinary work of architecture, and it was quite unusual, but when I was there I thought of one building in Australia which I thought had somewhat of the same character. And it wasn't Newman College, strangely enough. It was, in fact, Marion and Walter's Foliotta at Eaglemont. And those of you who know that building will remember that it's only 24 feet square. It is, in fact, 12 foot by 12 foot. A tiny building, a tiny domestic dwelling, which Marion said, and this is a direct quote from her autobiography, "You might say that our one moment of pure romance in our lives was that moment we spent in Foliotta, the cheapest, the most perfect and charming house in the empire." And that was her opinion of the building. And I found out at the library this morning they have a copy, or they have in fact the original envelope on which Walter Burley Griffin sketched the plan and section for that particular building. It was literally drawn up on the back of an envelope. It's something that nowadays doesn't happen, of course, because we don't have that many envelopes in the time of the internet. But in those days, if you remember, envelopes were the way in which people communicated, through letters. So there were many envelopes, and paper was, in fact, slightly more expensive than it is today. So sketching on the back of the envelope was, in fact, quite a normal procedure. But to have the original envelope in which Walter sketched and then wrote in his own handwriting Foliotta on the top of that sketch. Of course, that way of working was, in fact, very much consistent with his way of communicating and working with Marion. That sketch would have been translated into the building we now see very much through the hands of Marion. Unfortunately, in the 50s, I think it was, or the early 60s, a large, a three-bedroom addition was in fact appended to this perfect building in the 70s, actually. But Foliotta now desperately needs to be unappended, I believe, and restored to enable the original Foliotta to be brought to appropriate public attention. I understand the current owners, who I thought may have been visiting here today, but they aren't, they admire the doll's house, as Marion put it, greatly, and they would not be unsympathetic to some work of that nature. The problems are challenging, to say the least, but I am prompted to raise the idea, after the success of a similar project on a Robin Boyd house, and those from Melbourne will know of this, Robin Boyd House in Walsh Street, South Yarra. What was set up a few years ago was the Robin Boyd Foundation, which now manages that house on behalf of the public, in fact, and is now open to the public for public inspection. I would very much like to see, hopefully in the future, something similar to perhaps a Walter Burley Griffin Foundation that may begin to work on the retention or restoration of some of the great buildings left to us by the Griffins. If that idea strikes a chord in anyone in this room today, please see me at 2 p.m. and we can discuss it over drinks. And I'm sure the discussion will be appropriately intellectual, as befits a Greek symposium. Thank you very much for the time.
My great pleasure now to introduce Paul Cruty, all the way from Chicago. Paul is Professor Emeritus of Architectural History at the University of Illinois, where he taught for more than 2 decades. He's a leading authority in America on the Prairie School architects, including Frank Lloyd Wright and, of course, the Griffins, on whom he has notched up a number of impressive publications, including Walter Burley Griffin in America in 1997, 2 American Architects in India, Marion Marnie and Milliken Place, and most recently an essay on Marion's drawings in the wonderful Marion Marnie Reconsidered publication. I first met Paul when I was developing the Beyond Architecture exhibition at the Powerhouse, and he made a tremendous contribution to that exhibition. And I just want to formally thank you now. It was 15 or so years ago, but it was a wonderful experience working with you and meeting Jane as well. So that was in 1998, that exhibition. Paul came out for the opening. The previous year, he'd organised and hosted the first international symposium on the Griffins on the University of Illinois campus. And he came out again in 1998, in October, I think it was, for the symposium in Melbourne, but hasn't actually been out since. So we're very fortunate to have him here this afternoon. Since the Beyond Architecture exhibition, Paul was instrumental in organising the Walter Burley Griffin Society of America, I think in 1999, and organises its series of lectures and tours. And Paul is going to, the topic of Paul's talk this afternoon is Small Town to National Capital, Walter Burley Griffin's Ideas about Architecture, Landscape and Planning from 1901 to 1913. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Anne, for that very kind introduction, and I am really thrilled to be back here after 15 years. So thank you to the Walter Burley Griffin Society for making that possible. And, of course, particularly John and Adrian Kabos. And I suppose James Wyrick for thinking I might have something to contribute today. So, as Anne said, my topic is this from small town to national capital, Walter Burley Griffin's ideas about architecture, landscape, and planning from 1901 to 1913. That is, in a sense, the background to the Canberra Plan and all of his subsequent designs in Australia and India. In the heart of the Midwest of the United States is a bridge that figures prominently in one of the icons of Americana, the so-called Music Man Footbridge. The inspiration for the place were the leading characters' rendezvous at the climax to Meredith Willson's famous musical of that name, a story set on the 4th of July, 1912. A view from that actual bridge, the one that inspired Wilson, looks over a remarkable landscape and planned community that also reflects a deep-seated desire to create something truly American, and includes two extraordinary architectural masterpieces, all designed by someone who was, in fact, in that town, actually Mason City, Iowa, the week after the real 4th of July, 1912, with his new sketches for this site and its houses. An equally and quintessentially American story, and one that actually happened. That person, of course, was Walter Burley Griffin, one of those remarkable Midwesterners who populated Chicago at the beginning of the last century. Among them, Jane Addams and Torsten Veblen, Harriet Monroe and Daniel Burnham, as well as the architect Louis Sullivan and his followers, including Robert Spencer, Marion Mahoney, and of course, Frank Lloyd Wright. Uniquely among that creative group, Griffin's career encompassed the three separate disciplines of architecture, landscape design, and urban planning. And what he accomplished in America is only a part of the complete Griffin. For as everyone here knows, he moved to Australia in 1914 and moved again to India in 1935, where he died 2 years later, having just turned 60, at the height of his powers and very much on the young side as architects go. By comparison, if Wright had died at that same age, none of his late works, from Falling Water to the Guggenheim Museum, would exist. It is the development and maturing of this trio of separate but interlocking creative endeavors, planning, landscape, and architecture, in Griffin's American work that we will briefly trace here. Walter Burley Griffin was a man with a mission, one whose particular source we know, for Griffin himself told us, "The event that changed my life," he reported, was as a young man hearing Louis Sullivan deliver a stirring lecture in 1900 urging young architects to create not copies of old buildings, but a new democratic American architecture derived from nature for the modern world. Griffin then, like Frank Lloyd Wright, was one of the followers of Louis Sullivan, that is a group we call the Prairie School. Griffin was strongly influenced by Wright's example, but he was never, in any meaningful sense, a follower of Wright, much less Wright's student. Indeed, down here in Australia, he is sometimes considered the equivalent of Wright. Like Wright in America, Griffin has been given his own postage stamp. Notice for a moment that Griffin's was issued in 1963, 5 years before Wright's, and that it is a 5-penny stamp, while Wright's is only worth 2 cents. I grant you Wright's name is bigger, but no surprise there. Beyond that, Griffin has his own commemorative medal. Of course, he has his own lake here at his capital city, Lake Burley Griffin. But he even has his own rest stop on the way to Canberra. To repeat, it was most importantly Sullivan's ideas that set Griffin on his path to one aspect, at least, of his life's goal: to create an architecture that was rational and functional, yet was also expressive and responded to nature and to its culture. To this, Griffin added his own requirement, not explicitly found in Sullivan's work, that this architecture itself be fully a part of and respond to its natural and cultural surroundings, the environmental and urban contexts in which it is placed. Once this approach was fully formed in his imagination, it remained with him throughout his career, wherever his practice took him. So now, in order to shed some light on Griffin's work in Mason City, and to see how the Canberra plan fits into all of this, as well as Griffin's August 1913 first visit to Australia, we will take a few moments to trace his career through Canberra and up to the point when he arrived in Mason City on that July day in 1912. Incidentally, I invite you all to spend a May Day in 2014 in Mason City, touring all the Griffin houses next year when the American Griffin Society holds its 15th annual meeting there. And we'll even see some Wright buildings. Growing up in Chicago's western suburbs, Griffin, by his senior year at Oak Park High School, had decided to become a landscape gardener and paid a call on the famous O.C. Simons, one of the creators of Chicago's Graceland Cemetery, who advised him to study architecture instead, that being a real profession and one that would allow him the means to pursue landscape gardening at his leisure. Which Griffin did, enrolling in one of the country's most important and earliest architecture schools, the University of Illinois. In the fall of 1895, he entered the strict program of architectural studies instituted by Nathan Clifford Ricker, a towering figure in American architectural education who had studied at the Bau Academy in Berlin. Ricker placed particular emphasis on the science of building rather than the traditions of design. And here is Griffin, lower right, 2 rows below white-bearded Ricker. Following graduation in 1899, Griffin found a job in Chicago's Steinway Hall building where he worked for the next 2 years. The little group of progressive architects here included Griffin's first employer, Dwight Perkins, later father of Chicago's Greenbelt Forest Preserve system, the talented and generous Robert Spencer, who later proved to be one of Griffin's strongest local supporters, and Spencer's friend Frank Lloyd Wright, who had only just moved his practice to suburban Oak Park. Responding to Sullivan's call for a new architecture, these architects had already shared ideas and draftsmen for several years. In July 1901, Griffin became a licensed architect, which, coupled with 2 years' experience and a university degree, would have allowed him to open his own practice. Instead, he accepted Wright's offer to join his Oak Park studio. Griffin now participated in that most exciting creative endeavor in modern architecture, the blossoming of Wright's prairie style. Here he met another licensed architect, Marion Lucy Mahoney, an 1894 graduate of MIT, who would create for Wright one of the most famous rendering styles of the 20th century. Griffin proved a great asset to Wright, making regular checks on the progress of many of Wright's most innovative buildings, including the Willits, Dana, and Martin houses, and the Larkin building, while often mollifying clients and contractors who had been slighted in some way or another by the mercurial Mr. Wright. During his first year working for Wright, Griffin accepted an outside commission, his first independent job, to provide not a building design, but both campus and landscape plans for a public teachers' college in downstate Illinois, the Eastern Illinois State Normal School at Charleston. Setting a formal garden and drive in front of the principal building, Griffin created naturalistic groupings of trees and shrubs around the rest of the site. He listed his profession as landscape gardener, as you see on a page from the specifications. His landscape credentials at this point consisted of his wide-ranging personal study and his innate ability. By his second year in Wright's office, Griffin was providing landscape plans for many of the houses, a subject of little interest to Wright at this time, including the plantings of the Ward Willets house, clearly meant to capture various views to and from the house, and the famous floricycle garden for the Darwin Martin house, which was to provide a changing panoply of color and form throughout the growing season, organized in a structural manner, treating plants almost like architectural elements. And then, after more than 4 years with Wright, including running the office while the Wrights were in Japan in 1905, and apparently without any prospect of partnership, in spring 1906, Griffin left Wright and returned to Steinway Hall as an independent architect, giving himself the title of architect and landscape architect. Indeed, his first commission was not for a building, but once again for an elaborate landscape plan for the Northern Illinois State Normal School. Griffin called for formal plantings on axis and a picturesque garden spreading out from it. By this time, he had enough practical knowledge about nurseries and suppliers successfully to complete such a large-scale undertaking in a way he lacked in 1901. Yet architectural design was to be Griffin's bread and butter, as O.C. Simons predicted. In his first house designed as an independent architect, created later in 1906 for a Chicago developer, Griffin's first prairie style emerged full-blown. Casement windows decorated with wooden muntins and clear glass, raised ceilings, and an interest in diamond forms. The plan is of particular importance. Here, Griffin produced the first L-shaped or open plan. The plan provides a flowing interior spatial effect within a simple square or rectangular footprint, in effect reducing the complex Wrightian spatial revolution to a repeatable formula that was easy to build. It was to become the standard plan of the low-cost house of the Prairie School, as you see in this example by Griffin himself. Griffin naturally worked not just to design innovative yet elegantly simple buildings, but to unite these buildings with their landscapes. Thus, his early practice includes many examples of paired houses, such as these two, which, though contrasting in form, have the same molding and cornice heights, and are connected by a garden wall that extends the architecture into the landscape. He also created pairs that were mirror images of each other, with the buildings capturing and defining the space between them. By 1910, he was busy tackling all three of his interests. He was not only producing proposals for whole streets of low-cost houses for developers, but making his first suggestions for suburban housing plans, including this proposal to replace a rectangular grid with a street plan that more efficiently followed the rolling topography seen on the lower image. Well, this is an example of what we would call city planning. Griffin clearly felt that landscape and urban design were both included in what for him was the all-encompassing term of landscape architecture, and thus he was a landscape architect. At the same time, he continued to provide landscape gardening plans for many of his own houses and occasionally those of other architects, as we see in this collage of all three creative endeavors. By this date, 1910, Griffin's architecture itself was changing, becoming more simplified and monumental, to produce what may be called his second prairie style. Using hollow clay tile and concrete block, he created massive cubic buildings that were precociously flat-roofed and without Wright's overhanging eaves. This one was made entirely of reinforced concrete. It was immediately dubbed solid rock, and was surmounted with a luxurious roof garden. But even here, Griffin was soon thinking about how buildings in his new style would fit together. Or rather, he never stopped thinking about the subject. Here is Solid Rock 2, as it was intended to be paired with the first Solid Rock and designed for the same developer. This remarkable development in Griffin's work occurred shortly after Wright had left the Chicago scene for his European trip and subsequent move to Taliesin in rural southwestern Wisconsin. Ironically, Griffin became indirectly involved in Wright's practice. When Herman von Holst, the architect who agreed to finish most of Wright's projects, promptly hired Marion Money to do the design work. And Money, remembering Griffin's landscape plans when they both worked for Wright, convinced von Holst to hire Griffin to landscape several of the houses being built in the central Illinois town of Decatur. More than architecture was involved here. And after several months of canoe trips up and down the Kankakee River, Walter and Marion were married in June 1911, forming a personal and professional partnership that lasted until Walter's death 25 years later. By the time of his marriage, Griffin had already designed his first surviving complete town plan, one that combined planning, landscape, and architecture into an entire urban assemblage. It was to be called Idalia, after Ida, the wife of the client, Chicago developer Edward Stanton, and to be built in south-central Florida, inland from the Gulf of Mexico. Here is the first existing record of Griffin's ideas about city planning. Public buildings grouped around a central mall and surrounded by less formal residential districts. On the site plan, Griffin provided a list of tropical plants to be used by Stanton, and several months later designed a store and warehouse building to be located near the main dock from the river. City planning, landscape design, and architecture in a single project. While Stanton was naming the streets of his newly platted town in the summer of 1911, Griffin began work on a design of immensely greater scale than anything he had done before: the entry in the international competition for an Australian capital city. The 12 sheets of drawings, as rendered by Marion Money and her assistants, record one of the most significant chapters in the history of modern urban planning. And from among the 137 worldwide submissions, the committee announced the winning design in May 1912, Walter Burley Griffin of Chicago. The wide-ranging sources that Griffin could call upon for Canberra included Chicago's Columbian Exposition, which had overwhelmed him as a 16-year-old, as well as Frederick Law Olmsted's picturesque planning of Riverside, a suburb nearby his hometown of Elmhurst, whose entire existence was defined by its natural surroundings. Similarly, Griffin drew upon such city plans as Wren's scheme for rebuilding London and L'Enfant's plan for Washington, D.C. He eagerly studied the literature of the English Garden City movement and the City Beautiful movement, especially as embodied in Burnham and Bennett's 1909 plan of Chicago, which, by appearing just before he began his own city, challenged or confirmed many of his ideas. Griffin's outspoken progressive stance, as well as his avid embracing of Henry George's single tax idea, played key roles in his thinking. As he explained, "I entered this Australian event solely because I have for many years greatly admired the bold radical steps in politics and economics which Australia has dared to take." In Australia, he was warmly embraced, at least in some quarters, as a single taxer and social reformer, as you see on the left, and as architect and Democrat. As James Wyrick has long argued, Canberra, quote, was intended to express in physical form the true nature of the democratic experience. The site, and please forgive the irony of my explaining this here to you, can I say, a rolling valley surrounded by hills and bisected by the wide stream bed of an intermittent river, was dominated by the hill in the background, Mount Ainslie, which was not included in the competition site plan showing the proposed city limits. Griffin selected it as the defining feature of his entire plan. Here it looms above the city and water. He proposed that the whole mountain be a nature reserve, and it still is, as you know. The axis defined from Mount Ainslie to the highest point in town became the generating line of the whole plan. Where this line crossed the river, Griffin created a cross-axis to be given expression by creating a series of lakes, the central three of which would be formal and geometric, and the outer two left irregular. Thus, the basic format was determined by the landscape. Griffin intended his plan to provide a legible cipher of the interrelationship among the political, economic, cultural, and spiritual forces at work in a progressive, democratic nation. The very placement of the public buildings in the Great Federal Triangle, descending from the low hill to the central lake, revealed the relative positions of the branches of government. Although the competition guidelines only called for the general placement of some 38 public buildings, most entries included perspective renderings that attempted to give a corresponding architectural image to the city. Griffin went beyond this, making complete designs for all of them, and adding a structure of his own, the Capitol, that was to serve as, quote, the figurative embodiment of the spirit of Australia. David Van Zanten has recently written that the amazing thing about Canberra is that Griffin produced something ceremonial, natural, and structured all at once. Indeed, we would add that there is simply no real precedent for the hierarchies of building placement, the configurations of subtle changes in topography, and the unity of landscape to urban design found in the plan of Canberra. Winning the Canberra competition instantly changed Griffin's life. It was immediately reported in the New York Times. The closest Frank Lloyd Wright had come to national publicity by this time was the Chicago Tribune's headline that he had run off to Europe with the wife of one of his clients. Congratulations poured in, plus a host of lecture invitations, including, of course, the Chicago Single Tax Club, where he lectured about possibilities in an organic city, to which, as you see, ladies are invited, as well as feature articles in prestigious journals like the Architectural Review and Architectural Record. In the Chicago Tribune, the famous critic Harriet Monroe proclaimed that Griffin's success had, quote, scored a point for the Chicago School of Architecture, noting that this young architect was for 5 years a partner of Frank Wright. But that more importantly, like Wright, Griffin, according to Monroe, quote, drew courage and inspiration for original design from the example and precept of Louis Sullivan. Crucial to the present discussion, Griffin applied his Canberra experience to two major planning projects in 1912, a subdivision north of Chicago and the development in Mason City. The first, Trier Center neighborhood, involved developing 9 acres into 35 house lots. The site plan shows the new street and the houses arranged in pairs, most connected by walls and set to the outer edges of their lots to provide maximum open space, with interior spaces arranged so that, despite their closeness, the houses would provide private views to the landscape and not into their neighbors' living rooms. As he had done at Canberra, Griffin not only located each house, he actually designed all 35 of them. They would be of hollow tile with concrete veneer, low, flat-topped buildings with open plans. As a mark of its importance to him, Griffin took the unusual step of commissioning a plaster model to complement the site plan. In a manner quite different from a perspective rendering, the model, unfortunately lost, reveals what a group of 35 Griffin houses might look like. Even more unusual, the model includes Griffin's landscape setting, albeit in very schematic form. The scale of the buildings in relation to the landscape is key. Just as at Castle Craig a decade later, he did not want luxurious mansions of the kind springing up at nearby suburbs to blight his landscape. Not only did Walter invest his Canberra prize money in Trier Center, Walter and Marion planned to move into one of the houses. Their own house would have been the first house that the 35-year-old Walter or the 40-year-old Marion had owned separately or together in their entire lives. A crystalline expression of hollow tile and concrete with a 2-story living room, its decorative system of rotated squares producing the diamond piers along the upper walls. And then in that same year, 1912, Griffin arrived in Mason City, Iowa, 400 miles west of Chicago, a town that had already received designs for 2 houses and 2 commercial buildings from Frank Lloyd Wright. Let's review that chain of events first. In 1908, Wright had provided one of his many fireproof house plans based on Griffin's open plan concept to a doctor, which was built immediately. By year's end, Wright had garnered the commission for a pair of linked commercial buildings, the City National Bank and Park Inn Hotel. Construction began in late spring 1909. By the way, the hotel has been wonderfully restored and will be the site of our Griffin Society meeting next year. During one of his trips to Mason City, Wright met Joshua Melson, an acquaintance of the clients of the bank and hotel, Markley and Blythe. Melson, who was a contractor and developer, in 1907 and 8 had acquired tracts of land, including one he called River Heights, near the south side of the stream that ran through town, and began building modest houses on his lots, like this craftsman bungalow. In 1909, Melson approached Wright about a house for himself in his development. And Wright reconfigured the design he had given to several clients that year, including Isabel Roberts in River Forest, which he set back from the creek, as you see in the perspective published in the Vosmert portfolio the next year. Then something unexpected happened, at least as far as most people knew. Wright left for Europe in September 1909 to be gone for a year. He hurriedly tried to sew up everything before leaving, turning over the rest to Herman von Holst, who hired Marion Money to do the design work, as we have heard. Among these were the bank and hotel, but also Melson's own Wright House, which required not only working drawings and specifications, but a host of practical design changes as well, as Money soon found out, including the door wasn't even in the right place. Melson traveled to Chicago, as Money recorded in The Magic of America, to inquire about his house, and there met Griffin through Money. Melson presumably went back to Mason City with a glowing report about Griffin, because by spring 1912, Griffin was designing a new house for Melson, who had given up on his Wright House. We'll get back to that Griffin design soon. And was actively being approached by Melson, Markley, and Blythe about a much more substantial development. And so in late spring, the Griffins began work on this picturesque tract of land, designing houses, but hoping for much more. The difficult site had resisted development, which had passed it by in the 1880s. Here is an aerial drawing with the cliffs a bit exaggerated, and left it a garbage dump by 1910. Its weathered cliffs an occasional source of low-grade limestone at an abandoned quarry. The 18 acres, measuring roughly 800 by 1,100 feet, were divided by Willow Creek into a raised plateau above the steep cliffs, which they dubbed Rock Crest, and the gently sloping floodplain below, called Rock Glen. Melson was the principal property owner of Rock Crest, while James Blythe, the lawyer involved in the Wright Bank and Hotel development, was to manage Rock Glen. To Griffin, this had all the potential of melding architecture to landscape while enhancing the surviving vegetation and sewing the site into the urban fabric of Mason City. Thus, in mid-July, that week after the 4th, he traveled to Mason City to submit sketches for the first 2 houses, one in Rock Glen and Melson's own house on Rock Crest, and to discuss broader planning issues. The house sketches were approved, but in addition, by the time he boarded the train for Chicago, presumably through the strength of arguments delivered in his quiet, intense way, Griffin had convinced the hard-boiled businessmen to relinquish their individual land rights for the benefit of a common area on the floodplain. The 4 partners, Markley, Blythe, Melson, and William Holohan, further agreed to, quote, preserve and improve the natural beauty of the stream and ground abutting it. All the houses, all to face the creek, would be approved, quote, in accordance with the plans and recommendations of Walter Burley Griffin, landscape architect. Thus, Griffin returned home with legal rights to the design of 18 acres of real estate. Walter and Marion worked together feverishly to complete the planning. From Griffin's own landscape measurements and botanic surveys, Monty created an aerial perspective in the form of an astounding 3-part Japanese screen. Here is part of it. While the office drafters drew an inked site plan. The creek was to be dammed to form a broad pond, just as at Canberra, crossed with a low bridge connecting the two sides. The property accommodated 19 houses, 13 on the bluff and 6 on the floodplain. The latter moved to the outer edges of the site, retaining the lowland along the creek for common use. On Rock Crest, Griffin spaced the houses more evenly, dramatically placing 3 of them on the cliff's edge and 1 just below it. As he had done at Canberra and was doing at Trier Centre, he not only suggested their placement, he designed the houses themselves. Griffin simultaneously prepared construction documents for the individual buildings that Melson and Blythe began to construct. By the end of the year, contracts were let for the first 2 houses in the Glen, the first for Harry Page, and the second one built by Blythe and sold to lawyer Arthur Rule. Though different expressions, both houses were made of hollow tile, as the Rule photo reveals, and both were finished with rough textured cement stucco, as they called it at the time. Rock Crest on the cliffside particularly fired Griffin's imagination. For Melson, he created something extraordinary, a response to a specific site unparalleled among Prairie School buildings, including Wright's at the time, which the enthusiastic developer immediately constructed, and which has been magnificently restored by the current owners. Griffin placed the house to the very edge of the sheer cliff, in fact, on the site of the quarry. Reflecting the weathered limestone lining the creek, he covered the concrete frame with the same stone, set in courses mimicking the natural strata, so that it is virtually impossible to discover where the original layers end and the mortared courses begin. A building of primordial appearance, its facades are so three-dimensional that you can literally climb the walls, as Griffin himself did. For the windows and doorways, however, Griffin uncovered the concrete, faceted and rectilinear, providing a stunning contrast between natural and manufactured forms, between Sullivan's nature and contemporary technological possibility. Finally, he set gigantic architectonic keystones atop the window wall, with the wooden muntin patterns in the casement windows bringing the diagonal lines produced by the keystones down to the foundation, as you see in the drawing, and by inserting one of the surviving originals in the spaces. This inspired organic solution to a problem, so different from Wright's earlier response to the same client for a similar site, seemed so natural an expression of the condition at Rock Crest, Rock Glen, that Griffin used textured limestone on the base of the Page House and designed a stone wall around the entire Rock Glen site to give additional unity to the separate buildings. And he added expressive stonework to the next house, constructed in 1913 in Rock Glen for James Blythe himself. The surfaces of this reinforced concrete building were left plain, except where rough textured limestone, similar to that on the Melson House, was coursed at its base. To the main facade, Griffin added the expressive geometric ornament that characterizes his later work. Below the casements with their red glass triangles and the decorative panels, he placed a gigantic pane of tempered glass that nearly 100 years later still affords a remarkable view from the living room out to the communal spaces of Rock Glen. The second house contemplated for Rock Crest was for another partner in the original contract, William Holohan, whose lot just west of Melson's house contained a recessed grotto on its steep slope. Placed partway down the cliff and incorporating the grotto, the house would be entered from above, where a grand staircase descended to the dining room, which in turn overlooked a 2-story living room that gave onto the hexagonal porch enclosing the grotto. Holohan, alas, chose not to build this choice example of Griffin's later American style. Toward the end of 1912, Griffin heard about the political skirmishes that threatened Canberra and arranged a visit to inspect the site in 1913, the trip we are celebrating today. While in Australia between August and November, he was offered the 3-year contract to superintend the city's construction. Despite the great career risks involved, he accepted immediately. Returning to Chicago, he set about organizing his practice to let him leave. Shortly after Christmas 1913, he visited Mason City to press his clients on both sides of the creek to continue their developments. He was treated like a returning hero. To remind readers of his importance, the Daily Times not only explained his international significance and his continuing work with Blythe and Melson, but reported in the last paragraph, a bit over-enthusiastically, that Griffin, quote, is the architect of the Park Inn and City National Bank building. For perhaps the only time in Griffin's entire career, such was the situation that buildings by right were mistakenly credited to him instead of vice versa. Griffin left town with charges for new work from both Melson and Blythe on the Crest and in the Glen. Melson commissioned a speculative house on Rock Crest for a site shown in Monty's perspective with a house similar to Griffin's new offer to Melson. However, this new version had stone on its lower third, concrete over hollow tile above, and with its flat roof opened as a livable space, something not seen in the Melson, Blythe, Page, or Rule houses. And the sectional drawing shows that it actually had 5 levels, 3 stories including roof garden facing the creek and Rock Glen, and 2 levels set between and behind them containing stairway and bedrooms. This is Griffin's 2-zoned vertical house type, which he had developed at Trier's Center, but which works wonderfully well on this steep hillside. Down in the Glen, Griffin offered Blythe a set of 3 houses bordering State Street east to the bridge, replacing 2 houses shown on Monty's perspective. The result was unique among the Mason City designs by combining the 3 structures into a single composition, connected by raised platforms between them, with stairways leading down from these courtyards to the lower level of Rock Glen, exiting through semicircular doorways. The 2 outer houses continue the paradigm of rock-covered bases, while the center house shows exposed concrete from foundation to its rooftop garden and open trellis. In plan, this middle house repeated the 5-level, 2-zoned house, the hillside, as it were, being generated by the change of level from State Street to the floodplain of Rock Glen. The whole integrated design was one of Griffin's very best in terms of context, unity, contrast, form, and expression. Thus, even as he raced to settle his American affairs in early 1914, prepared to travel to Europe and back and arrange to move halfway around the world, Griffin's creative solutions continued to develop in remarkable ways. But shortly after this, the Griffins did indeed begin their Australian sojourn, expecting to be home in 3 years, in fact, never returning to their American practice. In the meantime, a former Wright and Griffin employee and staunch Wright loyalist, young Barry Byrne, agreed to manage the Chicago office. Notice that the letterhead makes it clear that while there is more than one architect in this office, there is only one landscape architect. Unfortunately, this arrangement did not go well. Eventually, the Griffins were forced to abandon their Trier Center house, taking a great loss on the whole investment, and perhaps more tragically, Byrne was not able to keep the momentum going in Mason City. Melson did not build the second cliffside house Griffin designed for him. Byrne did create a version of the 3 houses for Blythe, overseeing a revision of the one closest to the creek, which we now call the Schneider House, and substituting his own weak designs for the other 2. Lacking Griffin's experience as well as his ability with clients, or at least these clients, Byrne finally wrote to Griffin in exasperation, blaming the failing situation on the clients themselves. Quote, "I think that gang is made up of the most glorious set of pikers it has been my fortune to meet." Imagine Griffin's horror in 1915 at reading this characterization of the group of Mason City businessmen whom he had convinced to accept the Rockcrest Rock proposal 3 years earlier and for whom he had built the magnificent Melson and Blythe houses. But back in mid-1913, when Griffin first set sail, on a steamship of course, for Australia, he was still rejoicing in the great progress made at both Trier Center, the street had been graded and the first house was under construction, and Rockcrest Rock Glen, with 4 houses completed and plans commissioned for 4 more. And despite this growing success in America, in seeing his vision of a new contextual modern architecture coming to fruition, he was exuberant about the possibility of introducing these ideas to a land that he believed would even be more receptive. Returning to Chicago from his first Australian visit, he triumphantly affirmed to a critic, "A new style of architecture is to be created in Australia," citing chiefly among the reasons for this that because they have no traditions to bind them, the rising generation is free to develop naturally. Even though we know full well the pitfalls and misinterpretation inherent in such a point of view and the difficult events that ensued, which despite their mind-numbing wastefulness in many respects, resulted in much magnificent architecture, we can still feel the thrill that Griffin must have felt on August 18, 1913, when he first set foot in Australia. His creative imagination so full of energy and hope, brimming with the ideas developed during his American years of 1901 to 1913, whose possibilities he now prepared to use in a new context for the greater good of modern architecture, landscape, and planning. Thank you.